Brexit is causing weaker growth and a soaring inflation, according to the former governor of the Bank of England. The LSE says EU trade barriers have added an average £250 to household food bills, and Scots fishing chiefs are saying they were sold down the river and scoff at the talk of treaty renegotiation as just spin. With such colossal failures stacking up, and the former PM, who played a leading role in the Leave camp, finally exposed as a serial liar, will the current PM apologise to my constituents in Edinburgh North and Leith?
Mr. Speaker, I'll just point out to the honourable lady, because she's going on about the EU and us leaving it. We have actually grown faster than France and Italy since we left the single market.
The UK economy is estimated to be 5.5% poorer now than it would have been if we'd stayed in the European Union. That's according to a study by the Centre for European Reform that compares the UK's current performance with a counterfactual UK that did not leave the EU. And this is the result.
The Centre for Economic Reform claims the government has lost out on £40 billion in taxes because of the damage done to the country's output by leaving the European Union.
That's £40 billion less to spend on our schools, on our hospitals, and all the things we collectively and so desperately need. In fact, when it comes to the economy, even arch-Brexiteer Nigel Farage now says this.
The UK economy is the only G7 economy not back to its pre-pandemic size. Business investment has lagged behind comparable economies. Economically, the UK would have been better staying in, wouldn't it?
I don't think that for a moment. But what I do think...
Based on all that?
But what I do think is we haven't actually benefited from Brexit economically.
What we've actually got is this.
The UK economy as a whole has been permanently damaged by Brexit. It's reduced the economy's potential output significantly, eroded business investment. I mean, look, if we hadn't had Brexit, we probably wouldn't be talking about an austerity budget this week. The need for tax rises, spending cuts wouldn't be there if Brexit hadn't reduced the economy's potential output so much.
Just like the Prime Minister, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has chosen to just stick his head in the sand and pretend none of this is happening.
I mean, do you deny that Brexit has meant the economy has grown less slowly than it otherwise might have been?
Well, what I don't accept is the premise that Brexit will make us poorer.
7 years after Brexit, millions can no longer afford basic essentials. Over 1 million adults can't even afford to eat every day. 3 million food parcels were delivered by food banks last year, and the UK as a whole has become poorer.
And as we heard from our honourable friend earlier, that every single international organisation has upgraded their forecast for UK economic growth.
In fact, in both 2023 and 2024, the IMF forecasts the UK will have the second lowest growth rate in the G7. So despite the Prime Minister telling MPs this...
The IMF, they said, it's right here, Mr. Speaker, our forecast, which he was very keen to point out just a few months ago. Now their forecasts are that we will have stronger growth than Germany, France and Italy, Mr. Speaker. What do they say? They're saying that we are prioritising what's right for the British people.
For the next 2 years, Britain's economy is still almost at the bottom of the G7 growth table. And it gets worse. Inflation is still high, running at 8.7%. And if that's not bad enough, the inflation rate for food and non-alcoholic beverages is a staggering 18.4%. And the elephant in the room, which the government is too terrified to mention, is again Brexit. According to research by the London School of Economics, Brexit is responsible for a third of UK food price inflation since 2019. So much for this.
We could have cheaper food, clothing and footwear straight away by getting rid of the protectionist anti-trade tariffs that the EU imposes.
And here's more from Richard Hughes, the chair of the Office for Budget Responsibility.
How much stronger would the economy be if we'd stayed in the EU?
We think that in the long run, it reduces our overall output by around 4% compared to had we remained in the EU.
How would you describe 4% though? Would that be the equivalent of another conflict or a smaller pandemic?
It's a shock to the UK economy of the order of magnitude of the sorts of other shocks that we've seen from the pandemic, from the energy crisis. Those have also had percentage point impacts on the level of output in 5-10 years' time.
Our exports have also grown by 25% just since COVID.
We'll tell that to UK fruit exporters. UK fruit exports to the EU have dropped by more than half since Brexit, and that decline's been put down to the introduction of trade barriers caused by the UK's departure from the EU, including mandatory health certificates on fresh and chilled food and customs paperwork. The actual OBR report the government is relying on says Brexit will result in the UK's trade intensity being a staggering 15% lower in the long run than if the UK had remained in the EU. It says latest evidence suggests Brexit has had a significant adverse impact on UK trade, reducing both overall trade volumes and the number of trading relationships between UK and EU firms. Even Rees-Mogg is now struggling to hide from the economic damage the Brexit he championed is inflicting on the economy.
But I'm joined by a particularly distinguished Professor of Economics at King's College London and former Chief Economist at the Cabinet Office, Jonathan Portes.
I'm afraid to say, what we have, the big evidence, I'm afraid, of the last 6 or 7 years is that things like uncertainty and the cost of Brexit actually have a more damaging impact on investment than the headline rate of corporation tax, because what the OBR says is we've now got pretty clear evidence that Brexit has reduced investment, and that's one of the reasons why the growth forecast going forward is so dismal.
There's also been a COVID pandemic and other things. But
but that's what you get that by looking at comparing us to other countries. It's not about COVID.
Well, that seems to have had quite a big impact, and the UK is a particularly open market.
The Prime Minister and his Chancellor just pretending none of this is happening is not only completely insane, it's grossly negligent.